Today we're talking to local author Jan Batiste Adkins, who recently released her book, African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County, which chronicles the struggles and successes of dozens of local Black pioneers starting as far back as 1777, and you include a lot of pioneers from the Palo Alto area as well. Thanks for being here, Jan. Now, I know that you've been studying the histories of local Black communities in the Bay Area for more than a decade, and you've written books focused on San Francisco, Monterey, and now Santa Clara County. So what prompted you to start doing this, and why do you continue doing it?
Well, I'm basically an historian as well as an English teacher. So I love to teach writing, and I also love history. And then I also love current events. You kind of put that together, and I identified a community that I knew very little about. And the community during the time when I first started my research was San Francisco. And I started reading the Black newspapers of the 1800s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and I read about the Black community, and I was just so excited and fascinated that I continued researching to find out more and more. So as I began to survey local history books, there was very little information in the history books about the Black community, and that's when I decided that something had to be done. And I wanted to document the information that I had discovered about the Black community of San Francisco. From that point on, I realized what happened with many early Black pioneers is that many of them began to migrate from San Francisco down to Santa Clara Valley, looking for farmland and places to raise their families, and then others went as far down as Monterey. And many came in from Monterey. So there was the in-migration and out-migration was going on with the Black community throughout the Bay Area. And I found it fascinating. And from that point on, I decided that it was time that we document the communities of the African-American communities here in the Bay Area.
How easy was it to find information?
Oh, well, on one hand, it was sort of easy because we have a wealth of archivists and historians in the Bay Area, and the librarians. I mean, they are so wonderful. So they were able to point me in the right direction. And it was, on the other hand, though, it was difficult because I also had to identify community resources, families that currently lived in the community that had old family photos and could tell their family stories. And so it was so on. And then churches, I had to interview the churches to find out about their history, especially those churches that started in the 1850s, 1860s. And so on one hand, there's a lot of information about many of the ethnic communities of the Bay Area at the libraries. And we have librarians and archivists that are just, that's what they enjoy researching ethnic groups. And at the same time, I found it to be exciting. It was exhilarating, but at the same time, it was difficult too.
You said for this book you contacted families and their descendants, like more than 50 families, just for this book alone, their histories.
Oh, probably. Yes.
And what was the reaction you got when you tracked down some of these people?
Well, it was interesting. Some families had been researched. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when I think oral research was very popular, and the libraries began collecting family information and began keeping track of families and recording the family stories. And so some of those families they told me where to go to read about their families. So much of the information I found at History San Jose. And others, I was able to find information at the libraries. And the beautiful aspect of the Bay Area is that we have historical societies all over. Every city has an historical society. And the historical societies, what they do is they collect photographs, oral stories, tape recordings of family stories and family history. So I was able to, through the families were able to lead me to where the information was actually housed. And in addition to that, many families had maintained the records and I was able to talk to some of the elders and the families to hear the family stories. So
that's what struck me about the book, because you put so much information into this book, and there's so much like personal stories in here that struck me.
What really struck me too about the book is that it's not only past history, but you've also talking about some current history as well, right? I mean, we see the contributions of people like Judge Cordell and Roy Clay and a lot of people that are still alive today. And how surprised were they that you wanted to get down their histories as well?
Well, many of them were very surprised. And I focused on people who were the first person who accomplished a particular goal. Like, for instance, the first female African-American judge, Doris Cordell. And so I was able to, I had to pretty much identify the kind of, the qualifications of people who I would include in the book in terms of the current people. I wanted to make sure those who had, in fact, opened the doors for others, that those people were in the book. I also, towards the latter part of the book, I not only identified those who had opportunities, but then I identified people who made opportunities for others. And I think that's really important too, because what I found in the Black community is that once many leaders were able to accomplish their goals, they turned around and made a way for others. And so it was that whole idea of reach back and pull one through. And so I saw that, and that seemed to be the story from the 1970s on. And that was exciting for me. So I included that was
one of the things also that Doris Cordell had mentioned, right, in the book. I think you have a quote from her parents who basically said not to think that she did all of this herself, but she needed to look back at all the other people who struggled to make it all possible.
To make it possible. Oh, right. Yes, exactly.
So if we're looking back kind of in the early days when people came down from San Francisco and they started to come down to Silicon Valley, could you kind of give us an idea, a snapshot of what was the population like? I mean, how many African Americans were actually down here? Or were there just like 10 families, let's say in Palo Alto, for example? Do you have any idea of what the actual population was?
Well, I've included the population data in the book. So the numbers in Palo Alto were very small. Many people migrated from the Midwest and from the South. Many people came to Palo Alto in search of work, many African Americans in search of work. Some came as porters on the railroad at the turn of the century. And they actually lived in Mayfield, Mayfield, yes.
It was probably like Mayberry back then.
Probably. And others came in search of employment from the Midwest. And so they worked as janitors or worked as yards, working in maintenance areas and working in homes in terms of, and also working as nannies, working to help the families. And so because this was common work, many African Americans who came here did that kind of work. Others worked in grocery stores, labor kind of work, and others worked on farms. And others worked at Stanford, working in terms of maintenance and at the animal stocks and things like that. So what happened is that and that seems to be the story throughout the county. In San Jose, many came to San Jose. Well, in San Jose, we had many that migrated to San Jose to establish opportunities for jobs. In other words, businesses, local businesses. So we had janitorial businesses. We also had plumbing businesses that were established at the turn of the century. We had a moving business established. And so we see that throughout the history of our communities. We had people who were entrepreneurs, and we also had people who worked for others. And this was the same San Francisco. The story there is identical, except for the agriculture. Wasn't so much agriculture work, but many people are either working for hotels and motels, hotels rather, but also other people who are working for banks and working in saloons. But we had other people who are establishing their own businesses. So we see that same kind of consistent story throughout the Bay Area.
There was an interesting photo that you had also of Boy Scouts, a Boy Scout troop marching down, I think it was down University Avenue.
I know.
And so I was kind of curious about that. It's like, it sounds as though, I mean, just on the surface at any rate, when we see a picture like that, the question that came to my mind was about the cloistering of a population of people. And I wondered whether or not how involved or how well integrated was the African American community with the larger communities in which they lived, or were they basically kept in isolation? How were they treated?
Well, I wouldn't say that the African American community was kept in isolation. I would say that the African American community, as a community, created community around churches. And so when the church provided the social needs, met the economic needs of the community as well as the spiritual needs of the community. So the church in all Black communities is the center point of the community. And so, and from there, out of the church, in often cases, Boy Scouts and these other social groups are created within the church to meet the needs of the youth or families or whatever. And so that in my research, I've discovered that the church is where things happen. So I wouldn't say that there was a sense of being forced. There wasn't forced segregation from that standpoint outside of housing. Housing clearly was an area where African Americans and people of color, because it was not only African Americans but Chinese, and we had the Hispanic communities and Indian communities were segregated in the sense that they were not able to buy housing with the general population. And there were actually restrictive covenances on mortgages that would not allow owners to sell their property to Black people, so people of color. So that in itself was established segregation. But I think that what happened is that the community came together and created a sense of community in each of the cities that I've researched.
What are some of the things that you found that were vibrant within that community? Let's say you mentioned the church, and which still today is centerpiece of African American community. But also, if we're looking at Boy Scouts and things like that, were there other things that you found that created this community? Were there newspapers? What kind of things did you come across?
Yes. So in terms of newspapers, yes, newspapers communicating within the community was very much established, and much of that was established within the church. San Francisco was the one area that had 3 Black newspapers that were established outside of the church. But in terms of, I was not able to find newspapers established in San Jose, and when I say that, I mean newspapers may have been established within the church, but it was not formally. So there was informal channels of communication primarily established. But in terms of social groups, there are lots of social groups that were established within the church. So we know the Boy Scouts, and we know that there were activities for girls were created within the churches. We know that there were senior programs within the churches. There were picnics, church-wide picnics, and things like this. So the church actually became the center point of the community, and that's where everyone went for their social and their activities. Outside of the church, as years progressed, then African Americans began to create social clubs outside of the church. So we had the sororities and fraternities. We had volunteer organizations. We had senior centers and different things of this type. And various community leaders also were responsible for providing that or organizing the community around a social event or a social problem in the community. So this was very much the same. So it wasn't a community, I wouldn't say that was completely isolated from everyone else, but it was a community that there was a sense of development within the community, growth within the community, and then reaching out into the other communities of the cities, as well as reaching out into other ethnic groups too.
We also see some big changes, I think, when Silicon Valley came into being as well. And so there was kind of a rise or dominance now of, tech people And in that, there were also African Americans as well, right? Who were really established.
Exactly. So it's interesting. What I discovered is that many of the tech companies actually reached out to African Americans right after the war. And so during the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, African Americans were recruited from black schools and were brought into Silicon Valley, or what was at that time just Santa Clara Valley. African Americans were also recruited from the military, and those that had developed skills in the military were able to find jobs in Silicon Valley in various industries that related to the jobs that they performed in the military. Then we had others, though, who came to Silicon Valley in search of work, and they were able to, they were hired through various job training programs, entry-level positions, and manufacturing, and packaging, and things like this. So it was basically at two levels. We had the professional levels were recruited through the African American colleges and universities, and then we had people from the community that were hired in entry-level positions. And so, I mean, I thought, for instance, Roy Clay, there were brilliant people, brilliant African Americans that were that relocated with companies in Silicon Valley and lived and contributed and often went on to other places. And often left and went to other places. And so there was that in and out sort of migration in terms of industry and technology. And I wouldn't say the numbers were high, I mean, but at the same time there was, and when I interviewed people who worked in industry or who had retired from industry, the story was the same. Oh, I was recruited from a black college back east, and then IBM recruited. It was one of the during the 1960s, many African American men were recruited through IBM. And these companies also, in the case of IBM, provided housing. And so they were able to deal with the housing issue, and which has a lot to do with why there isn't, why the black community wasn't just limited to one particular area, because many of these companies had housing, and then African Americans were able to find housing like in South San Jose and other places. Palo Alto's story is a little bit different because of the fact that it was Eichler who opened up housing and made housing available to anyone who could afford it. He said it didn't matter the color of your skin; it mattered whether you can afford to buy the house. And so that was a definite opportunity that was available to people of color. It was all people of color that were able to live were no longer segregated and were able to live in other neighborhoods. But in terms of industry providing housing, I don't know that was the case in Palo Alto. Right. But that was the case in San Jose.
Right. I think I've heard when I interviewed, I think it was Frank Green or even Roy Clay, one of some of the Silicon Valley pioneers. They basically, they could go to work, but I think that they were restricted because of those covenants in some ways. They couldn't buy a house that they could afford to buy.
Right.
And I guess once Eichler came in, that's different.
Right.
Jan, what were what was one big surprise you discovered in doing your research about Palo Alto? Is there anything that really stood out?
Well, yes. First of all, it was very surprising to find out that Mayfield existed, and that's where many people of color lived, in Mayfield. And then the reason for that is because the porters were able to find housing around that within Mayfield, and then from that particular group of people, others also were able to find housing and begin to migrate from Mayfield. And then I was shocked to find out that Sam McDonald was the deputy sheriff of Mayfield, and that was amazing. And I have his book, and I have yet to identify exactly how he felt about that particular.
He was superintendent of Over at Stanford
At
of the
Stanford,
grounds?
Of the grounds.
Okay.
Exactly. So
that was an elected position, wasn't it?
I'm still. I think it was appointed, but I'm still discovering. I'm still discovering exactly how that happened, and it's very difficult to find this information.
What time period was that? Was that in the early 1900s?
That had to have been around 1895. So that was something that I was quite surprised about. And like I said, I still have to identify exactly how he was appointed in that position. I understand it was appointed. I don't know, but I have yet to discover how that happened. So that was a total surprise for me.
There's probably another 10 years worth of research there for you.
I know. His story is so surprising. I was surprised to find out that he actually came from Gilroy with his father and his brother, and he worked the farms in Gilroy, and then he traveled and left the state of California, but came back. And then from that, when he came back by himself as a teenager, as a young man, he then lived in San Jose and worked his way to Palo Alto and made Palo Alto his home. And that was a wonderful story, and I love his story.
It looks like there were a number of people, a number of blacks in law enforcement in your book as well. I thought I saw like people with badges, and they seem to be, it's like, that looks pretty interesting.
Yes. So along with industry, the private sector, so the public sector during this time also offered opportunities, opened the doors for African Americans, and we had the first African American hired. Well, actually, it was Ellington. Philip Ellington was the first African American who joined the police force as a volunteer. He was a volunteer, and this was in the 1940s. And then after he volunteered, then one of his family members was actually hired to as the first patrolman for the police department. And so that was very surprising to me. And in addition to that, then after that, then we had several others. Walter Atkins was the first chief of police. And then we had fire chief. We had the first black fire chief, which was I think around the 1970s, and then who hired the first black female. And so yes, there were many African Americans began to were established in many different career fields, both public and the private sector.
Now, Jan, you're speaking in Palo Alto next week, correct? Can you tell us the information on that?
Yeah, so I'll be speaking for the Palo Alto Historical Society on Sunday, March 3rd, and it's from 2 to 4, and it's going to be at the library.
At Mitchell Park, I think. Yes.
Yes,
okay.
Mitchell Park Library, exactly.
Okay, great. Is there anything we didn't touch upon that you wanted to talk about?
Well, I just wanted to say that another surprise, I was surprised to find out that African Americans, well, people of African heritage, let's clear it up that way.
Yeah.
People of African heritage actually came to the Santa Clara Valley as early as 1777.
That was a real surprise in your book.
That was a real surprise.
Uh-huh.
I was shocked because I knew that the Pueblo was established, and I'm assuming these were Mexican and Indian farmers, but no, many people were of African heritage. And that I discovered in my research. And so there were several families. And also, I knew that Pio Pico was of both African and Spanish heritage, but his brother, Antonio Maria Pico, who was the judge, alcalde in San Jose, was also of mixed heritage. So the mixed Spanish and African heritage. And so some of the early history about the Santa Clara Valley was just exciting and very interesting. Many of us would think that African Americans came to California in the Great Migration. Well, first during the 1840s with the miners. That may have been, no, actually we were here even before then. And then in talking to others, I've discovered that people of African heritage were a part of building the Pueblo and part of building the various structures and So it's very wonderful.
That's really interesting. Did you find out how they ended up here? I mean, did they, were they escaped slaves? What was kind of the situation?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, many of them came with explorers. Many of them came as miners with groups to mine. Many of them came in looking for agricultural work. But those who came with the explorers, who were the ones that helped to build the presidios, along with the missions, along with integrated at the Pueblo, these things, we don't know. It was not possible to determine whether or not they were actually slaves on the ships. I would assume they may have been, because these were on the Spanish ships. But what was interesting, though, is that they were able to stay and live and create homes right in California. And that was what I found in my research with Monterey and also with my research on Santa Clara County too. So many of them were able, once they, I guess they left the ships and integrated into the community. I did read that many of the priests and wanted the men who were on these ships to marry the local women and establish families. And so there were people of African heritage that, I guess, found their freedom in California.
Well, Jan, thanks for coming out today. Again, her book is African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County. Thank you, and I guess that wraps up this week's Behind the Headlines. Thanks for joining us, and if you want to stay up to date on local Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com or visit us on social media.